It was a crisp fall morning in West Texas when rancher James Callahan saddled up his old horse for what looked like any other day. The 62-year-old had been up before dawn, like he always was, feeding his cattle, fixing fence posts, and jotting down notes in the little weathered notepad he always kept in his shirt pocket. Folks around Brewster County knew James as a steady, hard-working man, quiet but respected. The kind of person who never missed church on Sundays and always waved to passing neighbors. So when he suddenly vanished in the spring of 2008 without a trace, it rattled the entire town. One day he was seen checking the west pasture, and the next, nothing. No footprints, no truck tracks, no goodbye note. Just gone. The authorities searched his 300-acre ranch from fence line to fence line. Volunteers combed through canyons, dry riverbeds, and abandoned barns. Even helicopters were brought in to scan the rugged terrain from the sky. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Eventually, the search was called off. The only thing left behind was his truck, parked neatly beside the barn with the keys still in the ignition. His cowboy hat, which he rarely took off, was nowhere to be found. It was as if the land itself had swallowed him whole. Rumors started to spread like wildfire in a drought. Some folks whispered that James had been running from something or someone. Others believed he'd simply walked off into the desert to die, like an old coyote sensing its time had come. But those closest to him didn't buy it. He had no debts, no health issues, and no enemies that anyone could name. He loved that land. He wouldn't just leave it. His family refused to give up hope. For 4 long years, they left the porch, light on every night, hoping he might walk up the gravel driveway like nothing had happened. But he never did. Then, in the summer of 2012, everything changed. A jogger named Melissa, training for a marathon and unfamiliar with the area, decided to take a new route through a remote stretch of desert near Big Bend. The sun was already high and the trail rough, but she pushed on, her water bottle bouncing. At her hip, her earbuds playing a podcast she'd already lost track of. That's when she tripped. She glanced down, expecting to see a rock or twisted root. But what caught her eye was something she couldn't quite make sense of. Half buried in the dirt was what looked like a cowboy hat, faded, sun-bleached, and coated in dust, and stuck inside it was a tortoise shell. Duct taped together, Melissa paused, heart pounding. At first, she laughed nervously. Maybe some desert artist's strange sculpture? A prank? But then she looked around and noticed more. Clothes, tattered jeans, a striped shirt, a worn leather jacket lying near a small hole in the ground. The fabric was stiff from years in the sun, but unmistakably human-shaped. She backed away slowly and called the local sheriff. What investigators uncovered in that shallow pit sparked more questions than answers. It was a scene pulled straight out of a modern-day Western mystery. The hat, once crisp and proud, now sagged and weathered, still resting on the shell like a marker left behind on purpose. The jacket bore a stitched name tag, faded but just barely readable. Callahan. The same Callahan who had vanished in 2008. News spread like wildfire. Local TV stations rushed out to the desert. Theories flew faster than anyone could keep up. Was it murder? A bizarre accident? Some survivalist's hideout gone wrong? Forensics teams arrived, slowly sifting through the dirt, piece by piece, trying to put together a story that no one had seen coming. And yet, some details just didn't add up. Why was there no sign of a struggle? How had the body gone unnoticed for so long, especially in a region that had been searched dozens of times? And what was with the tortoise shell? Was it a message, a symbol, a cover-up, or something far stranger? As reporters dug deeper, they discovered that James Callahan had recently been researching old Apache trails and had taken a sudden interest in local desert folklore just before he disappeared. Some even said he'd become obsessed with finding Something buried out there in an old journal. Maybe a treasure, or some kind of lost history. Could that be connected? Was he out there chasing legends when something went terribly wrong? To make things even more confusing, the land where Melissa found the remains wasn't part of James's ranch. It was almost 30 miles away, across rough terrain and far from any known trail. That raised the question, how did he get there? And more importantly, why? Even after identifying the remains through dental records, the case didn't bring the closure many hoped for. If anything, it deepened the mystery. James's family, while heartbroken, still believe there's more to the story. His sister Clara insists he wouldn't have gone out there alone unless he had a reason. He found something, she says. Or someone didn't want him to. So what really happened to James Callahan in 2008? Was it a tragic accident hidden by time and sand? Or is there a secret in the West Texas desert that someone or something is still trying to keep buried? In today's video, we'll walk you through the strange disappearance, the bizarre discovery, and the theories that have haunted Brewster County ever since. From law enforcement reports to family interviews, desert myths to unsolved clues, we'll try to piece together the puzzle. But be warned, this isn't a story with easy answers, because just when you think the mystery has been solved, another detail surfaces. Another question is raised. And what Melissa found that day in the sandwell? Let's just say it might not be the last clue waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us. You're going to want to hear what comes next. James Callahan wasn't just some rancher tucked away in the hills of West Texas. He was part of the landscape. His family had lived on that same land for 3 generations. The Callahan Ranch sat near the edge of Big Bend country, bordered by rugged desert, dry creeks, and miles of dirt roads that seemed to go nowhere. It wasn't unusual for James to disappear for a day or two when checking on livestock or repairing fence lines. But those who knew him best said he always came back. Always. That's why his sudden disappearance hit the community like a punch to the gut. His brother, Tom Callahan, took it especially hard. He spent the first few weeks after James vanished out on horseback from sunup to sundown, hoping to stumble across some clue the sheriff's team might have missed. He brought in bloodhounds, handed out flyers to hikers, and even tried talking to a few self-proclaimed psychics. None of it made sense, Tom would later say. You don't just vanish off your own land like that. Something happened to him. Law enforcement did what they could, but they didn't have much to go on. James had no phone on him, no GPS tracker, and his personal journals offered nothing unusual, just notes about the cattle, water levels, and a mention of a broken windmill out near the southern boundary. His wallet was in the truck. His boots were missing, which meant he'd left willingly, at least at first. But there were no signs of anyone else. No tire tracks, no shell casings, no blood. Just silence. Things got even stranger when people started digging into James's last few months. According to the folks at the local diner, James had started asking around about old Spanish trails and ghost towns. He was even seen talking with an amateur historian who'd claimed there were hidden mining tunnels out near the desert. Some thought James had caught gold fever, others figured it was just a distraction. Something to fill the quiet after his wife passed away 2 years earlier. His neighbor, Linda Moreno, remembered one conversation in particular. He came by one evening with this map, she recalled. It was hand-drawn, really old-looking. He said it had belonged to a friend of his grandfather. He asked if I knew anything about petroglyphs out in the hills. I told him to be careful. He just smiled and said, "There's more out there than people realize." So when that tortoise shell with the cowboy hat was found years later, the questions started piling up all over again. Who buried him there? And why in such a strange way? The hat had clearly been duct taped to the shell, almost like someone wanted it to be seen. But was it a warning? A marker? or just something symbolic that nobody could figure out. The site itself was eerie. The shallow pit where the clothes were found looked more like a small animal burrow than a grave. Yet somehow, everything was neatly laid out, the shirt folded, the belt still buckled, the boots just a few feet away. The shell was the most baffling piece. It didn't match any local species, and experts later said it had likely been carried in from another region entirely. It was all too deliberate to be random. When Melissa's discovery hit the news, people came forward with stories they'd never shared before. A hiker from 2 years prior recalled hearing what sounded like distant chanting in that same area one night, but chalked it up to wind and nerves. A ranch hand who once worked for James said he'd found strange symbols carved into a rock near the property line, but never told anyone, thinking it was just kids messing around. The sheriff's department reopened the case. They brought in forensic experts, archaeologists, and even a cryptologist to look at markings found on a nearby boulder. The desert had kept its secrets well, but now it seemed like they were beginning to stir. Theories began to form, some more believable than others. One said James had stumbled onto something buried long ago, something he wasn't meant to find. Another claimed he was following clues left behind by his grandfather, a man who'd reportedly gone mad in the 1940s. After months spent out in the desert searching for the Whispering Cave, one curious piece of evidence was found near the makeshift grave, a rusted old key wrapped in oilcloth. No one knew what it opened. It didn't match anything in James's house, barn, or truck, but it was placed there carefully, almost like a signature dot in town. The story took on a life of its own. Tourists started visiting the area, drawn by the mystery. Podcasts picked up the tale. Online forums filled with armchair detectives, each spinning their own version of what really happened. Some swore it was a cult. Others believed it was tied to Native American land and sacred burial sites. A few even suggested it was government-related, though no one could explain why a small-town rancher would be caught up in anything that dramatic. Still, one thing stayed the same. No one could say for sure how James ended up buried in a hole 30 miles from home, with his hat duct-taped to a tortoise shell. Back at the ranch, James's old dog-in, aging blue heeler named Duke still laid near the porch most evenings, as if waiting for him to return. The family kept his house mostly unchanged. His tools hung in the same spot in the barn. His journals were boxed up, though a few pages were missing, pages torn out sometime before he vanished. Tom Callahan, though older now and slower on his feet, never stopped trying to piece it together. He began tracing his brother's final weeks with a fresh eye, revisiting old maps, rereading letters, and talking with folks who may have seen or heard something all those years ago. "It's not about revenge," he said in a rare interview. "It's about understanding, knowing why." The desert has a strange way of hiding the truth. Winds shift the sand. Tracks vanish overnight. Bones bleach in the sun until they become part of the ground. And out there where cell service drops off and shadows stretch longer than they should, answers don't come easy, but sometimes the desert gives something back. A hat, a shell, a story waiting to be told. And while the mystery of James Callahan remains unsolved, one thing is certain. Something unusual happened in those West Texas hills. Something people still whisper about over coffee, long after the news crews packed up and left, because in a place where legends are born from silence, and time seems to bend with the wind, some stories aren't meant to fade, and this one is just getting started. The desert was quiet again, but the story of James Callahan was growing louder by the day. As more people began digging into the case, small details started surfacing, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together but still felt connected. Everyone had a theory, and no one had proof. But beneath all the speculation was one undeniable truth. Something had happened to James. And someone out there knew more than they were saying. One of the first new leads came from a woman named Grace Ramirez, a wildlife biologist who had been doing research in the Big Bend region around the time James disappeared. She remembered seeing a man who matched James's description hiking alone, carrying a rolled-up map and what looked like a compass tied to his belt. She didn't think much of it. At the time, it wasn't unusual to see loners exploring the desert. But what stuck with her was how focused he looked. He wasn't just wandering. He had a destination. When she later saw his picture on the news, her stomach dropped. Grace shared her story with the sheriff's department, and they marked the area where she saw him on a map. Strangely enough, it was only a few miles from where his remains were. Eventually found, but there were no direct paths between the two locations. Just open land, dangerous drops, and jagged terrain that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. At the same time, another angle started to emerge, one that pointed toward a man named Roy Weller. Roy was a retired miner who lived in a trailer about 15 miles from the Callahan Ranch. Locals knew him as a bit of a hermit, always keeping to himself. But in the months before James vanished, the two men had been seen together several times. According to Roy, James was obsessed with something he called the buried line. A term Roy claimed referred to an old smuggling route used by Spanish explorers and, later, by outlaws. Roy said James believed there was something hidden out there, something buried and forgotten under the dust and stone. Maybe gold, maybe records, maybe something older. Roy didn't believe in any of it, but he did remember one thing clearly. James had mentioned a name, Eladio Vega. That name had never come up before. A little digging revealed that Eladio Vega was a Mexican historian and cartographer who had gone missing back in the 1970s while conducting research in the Chihuahua Desert. He had been tracing ancient travel paths and believed there were markers etched into the land itself, symbols pointing toward a forgotten passage. His last known location, less than 50 miles from where James's body was found. The connection was thin, but it was enough to keep the mystery alive. Meanwhile, Melissa the jogger who'd found the site began receiving strange messages online. Some were from people praising her for bringing the case back into the spotlight. Others were warnings. Anonymous accounts told her to stop talking, to stay away from the desert, to let the past rest. At first, she ignored them. But then someone left a note on her car windshield. No name, no contact info. Just for words. You weren't meant to. Fear started to settle in. She installed cameras outside her apartment and stopped jogging that desert trail. But the experience had changed her. Something about that moment in the sand stuck in her mind, looping again and again. She began writing about it, not publicly, just in a notebook. But her words were filled with the same question. Everyone else was asking, what was James doing out there? Back in town, Tom Callahan kept working his way through James's belongings. One afternoon, while digging through a dusty trunk in the old shed, he found a small canvas pouch tucked behind a stack of horse blankets. Inside were fragments of old newspaper clippings, all about missing persons in the desert, dozens of them. Stretching back to the 1940s, ranchers, travelers, surveyors. Most of the cases were never solved. Tom also found a few scribbled notes in James's handwriting, with phrases like waterless well, iron markers, and do not trust third hand. It became clear that James had been researching something much bigger than a missing journal or lost gold. It was almost like he was following a pattern, trying to connect people who had vanished before him. But why? And did he ever realize he might end up on that same list? One subplot started to catch more attention. A small group of desert explorers who called themselves The Watch. They weren't well known, just a quiet online community of survivalists, amateur historians, and truth seekers. According to forum posts, they believed the Big Bend Desert held a kind of blind zone, a stretch of land where GPS signals died and time seemed to act strangely. One post from 2007 mentioned a man who had camped out there and returned a week later with no memory of how long he'd been gone. That man, it turns out, was interviewed once by James. His name was blacked out in all official files, but the description matched one of the missing names James had written in his notebook, everywhere. Investigators looked, new pieces turned up, but none of them fit into one clean story. There was no clear villain, no easy answer, no final twist that made it all make sense. That was the most unsettling part. Some believed James had uncovered something ancient, something that was never meant to be found. Others thought he fell into the hands of people who wanted to keep certain knowledge buried. But there was also a third group, those who believed James had found what he was looking for and chose not to come back. As theories piled up, the sheriff's department grew more cautious. Publicly, they stuck to the story that it was likely a natural death, probably exposure or dehydration. But off the record, some of the deputies admitted they were rattled, especially after one of their search dogs refused to go near the original site where the tortoise shell was found. It whined, backed away, and dug its heels into the sand. Dogs don't lie. And then came the phone call. Tom received it late one night, just after midnight. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite. The man said he had once worked with James, said James had found something he wasn't supposed to find. When Tom asked what that was, the man replied, "You'll know when the second marker is uncovered." Then he hung up. There was no trace of the call, no number, no location, nothing. But that phrase stuck with Tom like a splinter. The second marker. What was the first? The tortoise shell? The key? Or something else still hidden beneath the desert sand? The more they looked, the more questions they found. It's the kind of questions that twist in your stomach and keep you awake at night. Because in the heart of West Texas, where the stars stretch across the sky like silent watchers, some things aren't lost by accident. Some things are hidden on purpose. And now it was starting to feel like whatever James Callahan had been chasing was still out there, watching, waiting. The conflict wasn't just about a missing man anymore. It was about the line between what we know and what we're not supposed to know. And crossing that line might come with a cost. The weeks that followed that strange phone call were the most restless Tom Callahan had ever lived through. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the idea that someone was watching him, or the possibility that his brother had uncovered something dangerous, something meant to stay buried. Either way, Tom couldn't sit still. He kept going over James's maps, journals, newspaper clippings, trying to find something, anything, that pointed toward this so-called second marker. One evening, while looking over an old cattle trail map James had marked up, Tom noticed something odd. Two of the notations lined up with distant water sources, but neither had water. One of them was the place where the tortoise shell was found. The second was near a dry arroyo farther east, on the edge of a state-protected area. He remembered James mentioning that place once, said there was something eerie about the way sound traveled there. Like voices could bounce off the rocks in strange ways. It had seemed like a casual comment at the time, but now it felt like a lead. Tom packed up his truck early the next morning and drove out toward the arroyo. The landscape was harsh, wind-scraped, and empty, but he kept going. Hours passed, nothing but rocks, dry brush, and silence. Then he saw it. A formation of stones, arranged in a circle. At the center, half buried, was a slab of metal, rusted and bent, with something etched into the surface. It wasn't clear, but with some brushing and effort, Tom could make out faint markings that looked like coordinates. Below them was a crude drawing of what appeared to be a key. His heart pounded. This had to be it. The second marker. But as he stood there, studying the slab, he felt something strange. Not fear exactly, but pressure, like the air had thickened. And for the first time in all his searching, he had the urge to leave. Not because he was done, but because something told him he was being watched. He backed away, taking photos quickly, then headed to the truck. It wasn't until he was halfway down the dirt road that he realized his rearview mirror had been turned. Slightly, just enough to notice. He hadn't touched it. Back in town, Tom reached out to Melissa again. She hadn't spoken much since the online harassment, but something about Tom's discovery pulled her back in. Together, they started cross-referencing the coordinates from the metal slab with James's original notes. There was a pattern. James hadn't just been wandering, he was following a route. A trail of clues hidden in natural formations, old maps, and coded phrases. They realized he had left behind breadcrumbs, not just for himself, but possibly for someone else to follow. Maybe even Tom, as they dug deeper. One question kept surfacing. What was the end point? What was James trying to reach? One theory came from a man named Enoch Giles, a local desert guide who'd heard about the case through a podcast. He claimed he had taken James out to an isolated canyon once, years ago, after James paid him in cash and asked to be left alone for a night. Enoch said he thought it was strange, but figured James just wanted solitude. But the next morning, when Enoch returned to pick him up, James looked pale different. He said barely a word during the entire drive back. When pressed about what he saw out there, James only said, "I heard something I wasn't meant to hear." Those words stuck with Enoch. They made more sense now. Tom wanted to return to that canyon, but getting there wasn't easy. The terrain was brutal, and nightfall came fast in that part of the desert. He needed help. That's when he called Roy Weller, the miner who'd first mentioned the buried line. At first, Roy was hesitant. But when Tom told him about the second marker, something in his voice changed. Roy agreed to meet him, said he had one last thing to show him. They met just before sunset, out near an old prospector's trail. Roy brought a battered notebook and handed it to Tom. Inside were pages filled with hand-drawn symbols, maps, and strange diagrams. It was Eladio Vega's field journal, at least part of it. Roy said he found it hidden in a cave over 20 years ago, sealed in an old ammunition box. He'd never told anyone. Said it gave him bad dreams. The journal referenced a stretch of desert Vega called the Hollow Path, a place where sound didn't echo, where compasses spun, and where some believed time moved differently. Vega claimed that ancient markers, stacked stones, etched bones, and buried shells were placed to protect something. Not a treasure, but knowledge, something sacred, something people had died trying to find. Tom stared at the drawings in the journal. One of them was nearly identical to the tortoiseshell found with James's hat. Another showed a man kneeling before a flat stone, with symbols radiating from it like waves. Underneath, a caption in shaky Spanish, "No to-dos regrets, nel eco." Not everyone returns from the echo. Roy warned him, if you go out there, don't go looking for answers you're not ready to hear. But Tom was past the point of turning back. He felt like James had started something that had to be finished, no matter where it led. And maybe, just maybe, his brother had left more than mystery behind. That night, Tom, Melissa, and Roy made plans to return to the canyon. They packed supplies, charged satellite phones, and agreed to stick together, no matter what. Melissa brought a small camera rig, not to post online, not yet, but to document everything. In case something went wrong, the next morning, they set out just as the first light touched the desert floor. The sky was pale orange, the air already warming. Their truck bounced over rocky trails, dust clouds rising behind them like smoke. Hours passed. Then they reached the edge of the canyon. It was quiet. Too quiet. They left the truck and hiked down the narrow trail, the rocks crunching under their boots. The sun hung high, but the canyon stayed cool and shaded, like it held onto secrets. And then they found something. Not bones, not gold, but a circle of stones surrounding a blackened, pit-burnt wood, scorched earth. And in the center, half covered by sand, a third marker, a flat stone with fresh etchings. Etchings that hadn't been there 4 years ago when James first vanished. Someone had been here recently. Melissa stepped forward, camera in hand, and froze. "Tom, look at this." "Kay, let's scratch into the edge of the rock," was a single phrase. He found it. We watched. Tom's mouth went dry. His hands trembled as he reached down to brush away the sand, revealing more markings, coordinates, symbols, a half-finished diagram that looked eerily similar to something James had drawn. The canyon was dead still. No birds, no wind, just the sound of their breathing. Then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the canyon, came a low sound, like whispering, like wind moving through a hollow space. But none of them were speaking, and for the first time, all three felt a overwhelming sense that they weren't alone. Something was waiting, something James had found, and whatever it was, they were now closer to it than anyone had ever been, closer than they should be. Tom stood motionless, eyes locked on the etched words on the stone. He found it. We watched. They echoed through his mind, louder than the whispering sound curling through the canyon. Melissa lowered her camera slowly, her face pale, lips pressed tight like she didn't trust herself to speak. Roy took a step back, looking over his shoulder at the narrow trail behind them. None of them had moved, but all of them felt it, the shift. The air, the energy, the weight of something unseen pressing closer. Tom crouched near the marker, running his fingers over the rough symbols. These weren't just worn carvings. They were recent. Clean lines, sharp edges, maybe days old. Someone else had been harangued not long ago. But what were they watching? Who left this message? And if James had found it, what exactly had he found? Roy broke the silence, his voice just above a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." But Tom wasn't ready to leave. Something deeper pulled at him now, not just grief, not just answers. It was something James had known, something he'd tried to pass on. And now it was staring them right in the face. They pressed on, following the sound. It wasn't like wind. It was softer, like layered voices half caught in a dream. The farther they walked, the more the canyon twisted into strange formations. Walls curved unnaturally, like melted stone. Shadows didn't fall the way they should. The GPS dropped signal. Phones flickered and shut down. Even Melissa's camera began glitching, recording short clips that immediately deleted themselves. They weren't just off the trail now. They were somewhere else, somewhere James had been. Then they saw it. Up ahead, built into the canyon wall, was an opening. A narrow crevice, hidden behind brush and stone. It wasn't on any map, not even the detailed topographic ones Tom had studied. But someone had been inside. There were footprints, not old ones, fresh, boot prints. Big enough to be recent. Tom pulled out the old key James had hidden. It was rusted and strange, but the shape of the hole in the rock wall matched it almost perfectly. He slid it in, hesitated, then turned. The ground shook just for a moment. A soft grind of stone echoed from deep within the rock. The crevice widened slightly, and behind it, stairs descended into darkness. Roy stepped back, shaking his head. "This is where I stop. I know stories like this. You go down there, you don't come back the same." But Tom was already moving. Melissa followed without a word, her camera strapped to her chest, silently blinking red. Together they descended. Inside, the air was cold and still. The stairs wound deep into the earth, lined with old carvings and handprints smeared in reddish. Clay, not paint clay. Ash, maybe even blood. Symbols repeated down the walls, patterns that pulsed like warning signs the deeper they went. It wasn't a tunnel, it felt like a burial site. Or worse, a vault dot at the bottom. The space opened into a chamber. And in that chamber was another surprise. Someone was already there. A man stood at the far wall, his back to them, flashlight in hand. He turned slowly when he heard them, not startled, expecting them. He looked to be in his 60s, weathered but alert. Eyes sharp under a wide-brimmed hat. "You're late," he said calmly, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. Tom stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" The man gave a tight smile. "I knew your brother. We came here together once." The words hit like a punch. "You were with James." "Not at the end," the man replied. "But I saw what he saw. I helped him find the first 2 markers, then I stopped. He didn't. He wanted to understand. I wanted to survive." Melissa's voice cracked. "What is this place?" The man glanced around the chamber. "This is what your brother called the threshold. The place between the surface and what lies underneath. He believed there was something ancient buried down here, something that predates any map or memory." He was right. Tom was breathing hard now. Is James down here?" The man didn't answer directly. When he came down the second time, he never came back. "I waited. I followed the sounds. I saw the lights. And then I ran." Tom's chest tightened. "What lights?" But before the man could answer, the chamber shifted. A low hum started up, vibrating through the stone, through their feet, in their chests. Melissa's camera began flickering again. The flashlight in the man's hand flicked off. Everything went dark. Then the whispering returned, but louder now, closer, more voices. Not angry, not calm, just present. Tom reached for Melissa's hand, squeezing it tight. The man lit a flare, red glow washing over the walls. And that's when they saw what James had found. In the far corner of the chamber was a structure stone, circular and built like a pedestal, and on it rested a shell, just like the one Melissa had found years ago. Only this one wasn't empty. It was cracked, scarred, and pulsing slightly, like it was breathing. Melissa's hand shot to her mouth. The man stepped forward. "It's not about gold. It's not even about the past. This is the gate." Tom didn't understand. To what? The man looked him straight in the eye. To everything James couldn't explain. Suddenly, behind them came a sound, footsteps on the stone stairs. Fast, heavy, more than one person. The man's voice turned sharp. "They followed you." Tom turned. "Who?" The flare flickered in the man's hand as he spoke the words Tom hadn't expected. Words that sent a chill through his bones. The people who've been watching this place for decades. The same ones who made sure James never came back. Before Tom could react, a loud echo boomed through the stairwell. Voices, commands, flashlights. They were no longer alone. And just like that, the chamber lit up in flashes of moving light. Figures in tactical gear flooded down the steps, silent, efficient, faces hidden. They weren't law enforcement. They weren't locals. Melissa screamed. Tom stepped in front of her instinctively. The man dropped the flare and raised both hands. One of the masked figures stepped forward, looked at Tom, and said quietly, "You need to leave this place now." Tom stood firm. "Not until I know what happened to my brother." The figure stepped closer, lowered his voice even further. He opened it. Tom's heart nearly stopped. "What does that mean?" But the man didn't answer. He just raised a small black device and pressed a button. The walls shook. The shell on the pedestal began to glow. And from deep within the stone, something stirred. They were no longer hunting a mystery. They were standing inside it. The glow from the shell intensified, casting long, pulsing shadows across the stone chamber. It wasn't just light, it felt alive, like something waking up after a long, quiet sleep. The air thickened, humming with pressure, and the walls of the chamber vibrated with a low-frequency sound, not loud, but deep enough to rattle the bones. Melissa clutched Tom's arm, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. The masked figures stood still, weapons lowered, not in aggression, but almost in reverence. Whatever they were guarding down here, it wasn't just an artifact. It was something far beyond that. Tom stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. The man with the wide-brimmed hat didn't stop him. He just watched. "Your brother stood right where you are now," he said, voice barely above the hum. He reached out. He touched it, and then it changed him. Tom glanced back. Changed him how? The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a small alcove carved into the far wall. There, hidden in the stone, was a symbol, two overlapping circles, almost like eyes. And beneath it, a name carved in shaky, familiar handwriting. J. Callahan. Tom's heart jumped. That was James's writing. He turned back toward the shell. It had stopped glowing. Instead, it pulsed slowly, like it was waiting. Tom didn't know what he was supposed to do. He didn't know if touching it would answer anything or end everything. But something inside him whispered that if he left now, he'd never know the truth. Never really know what happened to James. So, he stepped forward and laid his hand gently on the cracked surface. The room went still. No sound. No light, just a wave of heat rushing through his arm and into his chest. His vision blurred, and for a split second, the chamber disappeared. He wasn't in the canyon anymore. He wasn't anywhere. He was standing in a field, James's field. The ranch. The sun was setting, golden light painting the land. And in the distance, he saw a figure standing by the fence line. James, he looked older, tired, but peaceful. He didn't speak, but Tom felt the message. It wasn't words, it was memory, emotion. James had found something in the canyon, something he couldn't explain. It had shown him things, time, space, other lives, and it had offered him a choice. Go back, or become part of it. He chose to stay, not out of fear, but because what he'd seen changed him forever. He knew he couldn't return and pretend life was normal. Tom reached out to him, but the vision slipped away. The field faded. The canyon returned. He was on his knees now, gasping for air. Melissa helped him up, her face full of questions. But before Tom could speak, the leader of the masked figures stepped forward. "You've been marked now," the man said. "You've seen it, like your brother. That means they'll watch you too." Tom blinked, still reeling. "Who?" The man tilted his head slightly, like he was about to say something, then paused. "They're not from here. That's all you need to know. This place isn't meant to be found, not by the world, and not by people who think answers fix everything." He turned to his team and gave a sharp signal. Within moments, they began dismantling the chamber, carefully covering the pedestal. Sealing cracks in the stone, preparing to collapse part of the tunnel behind them. It became clear they weren't just guarding a site. They were preparing to erase it. Melissa stepped in front of the man. "So what? That's it? No one gets to know." "You know," he said, "that's enough." Tom looked at the marker. Again his brother's name carved into stone. He understood now. James hadn't been buried. He hadn't been taken. He had chosen to stay. Because whatever that force was, whatever that shell held, it wasn't evil. It was old, powerful, and lonely. James had become a part of something beyond explanation. And that was his piece. As they made their way back up the tunnel, the air felt lighter. The whispers had stopped. The pressure had lifted. Roy was waiting at the top, flashlight still in hand. His face was pale, but he looked at Tom with a nod of quiet respect. They didn't speak much on the drive home. None of them could find the right words, and maybe they didn't need to. Some stories don't end with full understanding. Some end with a feeling. Days later, Tom returned to the ranch. He sat on the porch James had once sat on. The sky stretched wide above him, stars flickering like they always had. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. He opened his brother's last journal, the one he hadn't touched since the beginning. Inside the back cover was a folded piece of paper he had missed before. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a clue. It was a letter. Just one sentence. If you find it, don't be afraid to listen. Tom folded the paper slowly, eyes brimming with tears. He looked out over the land, wind brushing through the dry grass, and listened. But just as he stood to go back inside, his phone buzzed. One unread message. No name, no number. Just one line. There's a third marker. Don't go alone. And with that, the quiet of the ranch didn't feel so quiet anymore. The screen of Tom's phone dimmed, the message fading just as quickly as it had appeared. There's a third marker. Don't go alone. He stood on the porch of the old ranch house, heart pounding, phone still in hand, the wind rustling through. The dry Texas grass like it carried secrets. The stars above felt closer now, like they were watching. Maybe they always had been. For the first time since James disappeared, Tom didn't feel afraid. He felt clarity. There had been so many questions, so much mystery surrounding his brother's vanishing, the strange shell, the symbols, the hidden chamber. But now, standing here where James once stood, Tom understood something deeper. James hadn't been taken. He hadn't been a victim. He had been chosen, or maybe he had chosen himself. He had walked into something ancient, something unknowable. And instead of running from it, he had stayed. Tom didn't tell many people about what happened in the canyon. Melissa did share a few clips from her camera, but most of the footage had been wiped, corrupted, maybe, or erased by someone else. What she did manage to salvage became part of a quiet, compelling documentary that hinted at the mystery but didn't expose it. It wasn't about going viral. It was about preserving the truth in a way that respected what they had experienced. She titled it Whispers of the Hollow. And those who watched it truly watched, it felt the same pull that had first drawn James into the desert. The sheriff's office quietly closed the file on James Callahan's disappearance. Officially, his remains had been found and identified. Unofficially, there were no bones, no physical evidence, nothing to put on paper. Just a weathered hat, an old jacket, and a story too strange to explain. But Tom didn't fight the closure. He understood now that some answers couldn't be handed over in a report or tied up in a press release. Roy Weller moved out of his trailer a few months later. No warning, just gone. He left behind only a note pinned to his door. Some things are better left in the dust. Melissa kept in touch with Tom, but she eventually moved on, taking a new job in New Mexico. Before she left, she gave Tom the camera she'd used in the canyon. It no longer worked, but she told him to hold on to it. That place we'll call too. You again, she said. Just make sure you're ready. And Tom believed her. Not because of what he'd seen, but because of what he still felt. That pull hadn't left. He still dreamt of the canyon, of James, of the shell pulsing with soft light. Sometimes he'd wake up just before dawn and feel like he wasn't alone on the ranch. Not in a frightening way, more like something was still out there, watching, waiting. But not threatening, just observing. The journal James left behind had more than just notes and old clippings. Tucked in the back, in pages nearly torn free, were sketches. Not of treasure or maps, or landmarks, but of light. Patterns in the stars, flowing lines drawn around what looked like earth and sky. And in the center of each drawing was a small shell, always the shell. It was more than a symbol. It was a connection between James and whatever that thing was out there in the stone. As time passed, Tom began visiting the edge of the desert more often. He didn't go looking for the third marker. Not yet. He just sat there sometimes, staring out toward the horizon where sky met dust, letting the silence wrap around him. He talked to James out loud, not expecting answers, but feeling like he was heard all the same. The land, the wind, the stars, they had all become something more now. A story, a message, a presence, one evening nearly a year after the discovery. In the canyon, Tom received a small, unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a black and white photo. Grainy, faded, it showed two men standing beside a rock formation. One of them, unmistakably James. The other was the man from the chamber, the one with the wide-brimmed hat. On the back, written in small print, 1979. Eladio found the third. We didn't follow. There was no return address. No explanation. Tom stared at the photo for hours that night. That was the twist no one expected. Not just that James had found something, but that he wasn't the yet. First, that whatever this was, it had been going on for decades. Quietly, carefully, protected by those who understood its weight. Tom felt something shift inside. The story wasn't just about his brother. It was about all the others who had found. The markers who had listened to the whispers, who had chosen to stay hidden or vanished without a trace. And now Tom stood at a crossroads. He could walk away. Let the story fade into memory. Keep the mystery sacred and untouched, or he could follow the trail James had left him. Seek out the third marker. Face whatever waited on the other side of the echo. But Tom didn't decide right away. He gave himself space, time, and every now and then, he'd return to that quiet spot on the edge of the canyon, holding the old key in his hand, waiting to feel that pull again. In the end, maybe that's what James wanted. Not closure, not discovery. Just understanding that life like the desert is full of places that can't be mapped. Full of stories that don't fit inside headlines or case files. Some things are meant to be experienced, not solved. And sometimes the people we lose aren't really lost. They're just elsewhere, beyond the reach of signal and sound, whispering to us in ways we don't fully understand. So if you ever find yourself walking alone through the dry heat of West Texas and you hear a sound that doesn't belong, or see a shape in the rock that seems too perfect to be natural, maybe pause, maybe listen, because the desert remembers. And sometimes it speaks. Tom Callahan did eventually return to the canyon, but that's another story, one that hasn't been told yet.